Wernher von Braun, a German engineer, was passionately fascinated with rocketry from childhood. He was born in 1912 in Prussia. At 12, he carried out his first rocket test by strapping large fireworks to a toy car. In his youth, Wernher von Braun became enthralled by Hermann Oberth's works on space travel, realizing that the bulk of those publications consisted of mathematical calculations. Von Braun decided to overcome his dislike of mathematics so that he could study rocketry in depth. In 1930, he entered the Berlin Institute of Technology, where he became Oberth's pupil and joined the Rocket Club. His first assignment was to demonstrate the advantages of interplanetary rockets to ordinary citizens in a Berlin department store and to raise funds. At the same time, von Braun conducted dangerous tests of solid-fuel rocket engines, laying the groundwork for his future design career. In 1932, von Braun earned a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. That same year, the Army became interested in the Rocket Club's achievements in liquid-fuel rockets. During the initial stage of cooperation, despite numerous failed experiments, von Braun's team convinced the military of the need for additional funding. The Army agreed to move the work to a military facility. Although some club members opposed cooperation with the military, von Braun saw a chance to obtain resources for progress. In 1933, after Hitler came to power, von Braun and his colleagues moved to Kummersdorf, where work began on the aggregate program. In 1934, they successfully tested the A-2 rocket, which attracted the attention of both the Luftwaffe and the Army. The Luftwaffe allocated 5 million marks for a rocket plane, and the Army 6 million for continuing the aggregate program. Thus, at 23, von Braun received 11 million marks to pursue rocket development. In 1935, during a meeting with her son, von Braun's mother suggested Peenemünde as a place for rocket research. After visiting the site, von Braun convinced the military to create a test range there. In 1937, he was appointed technical director, and Major General Walter Dornberger became the military head of the aggregate program. A team of 20 people began work on the A-4 rocket. The military, disappointed by earlier failures, gave a concrete task: to create rockets capable of delivering warheads beyond artillery range. The exact date von Braun joined the Nazi Party is uncertain, either 1937 or 1938. He tried to refuse Heinrich Himmler's offer to join the SS, but on Dornberger's advice, he agreed, wishing to avoid conflict with the party. The first A-4 tests in 1942 failed, but after the project was granted the highest priority, the situation improved. In 1943, about 3,000 prisoners of war were forced to work at Peenemünde. The decision was made without von Braun's participation. British reconnaissance aircraft discovered the rocket test stands at Peenemünde, and on 17 August 1943, the RAF launched a raid. About 700 people were killed, among them Walter Thiel, head of engine development. Buildings were partially spared, but fires spread. Von Braun ordered that documents be saved, personally helping Secretary Dorrit Schlitt to retrieve them from a burning building. He organized cleanup, and the team resumed work within 14 days. Soon, Himmler took control of the A-4 program, demanding mass production even though the rocket was not yet ready. Von Braun opposed the haste, and 3 weeks later was arrested by the Gestapo on charges of subversive activity. Major General Dornberger secured his release 2 weeks later by Hitler's order, convincing the Führer that von Braun was essential to the rocket program. Von Braun returned to work on the A-4, now under military control, with production carried out through slave labor. He visited the site and saw horrific conditions. Workers were starving and exhausted. Though von Braun did not witness violence and deaths directly, he knew they occurred. The A-4 program was renamed V-2, Retaliation Weapon 2, and received Hitler's approval after a film showing numerous launches, actually a single launch filmed from different angles. The first combat V-2 was launched to bombard Paris on 7 September 1944. Although von Braun lamented the choice of target, observers noted his pride in the rocket's success. Later, a V-2 variant, MW-18014, reached an altitude of 176 kilometers, crossing the Kármán line. While creating a weapon, von Braun was also approaching his goal of exploring space. By 1945, it was clear that Germany would lose the war. Von Braun sought to avoid captivity by the USSR or Britain, forging orders to relocate 5,000 people, equipment, and documents to the Harz Mountains. He persuaded the guards to let the team move into a resort hotel, where they waited 5 weeks. In April 1945, after Hitler's death, SS guards began to disappear. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence compiled a list of German scientists for Operation Paperclip, with von Braun at the top. Eventually, his brother Magnus approached a group of American soldiers and announced the surrender of Wernher and his team. Von Braun was asked to list his colleagues and proposed 500 names. The Americans cut the list to 100, who left with him. In August 1945, von Braun and his team were taken to London, where he saw the ruins caused by V-2 attacks. In September, the rocket designer and his associates were transported to the United States, first to Boston and then to Fort Bliss, Texas. They served as Army consultants there, refurbishing and launching V-2s converted from weapons into research rockets. Early launches failed, but eventually the rockets crossed the Kármán line, marking the first U.S. foray into space. After the initial contracts expired, the Americans offered the German scientists new agreements with higher pay. Wernher von Braun and most of the team agreed to stay. In 1947, von Braun briefly traveled to Germany to marry Maria Louise von Quistorp and then returned to the U.S. He tried to propose new projects using larger boosters, but the Pentagon rejected them for budgetary reasons. As an alternative, the German engineer joined work on surface-to-air missiles. The U.S. Army opened Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, where von Braun became technical director of the Ordnance Guided Missile Center. Their goal was to develop a ballistic missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, which became the precursor to the Redstone rocket. While working for the U.S. Army, Wernher von Braun also popularized spaceflight through articles in Collier's magazine and forged contacts with Arthur C. Clarke, Walter Cronkite, and Walt Disney. One of his ideas was the von Braun wheel, a space station with a 200-foot diameter outer ring module that would rotate to create artificial gravity for a crew of 50. The station was intended as a stepping stone for future voyages to Mars. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union created a hydrogen bomb, and tensions increased. In 1956, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency ordered von Braun's team to develop the Jupiter missile, a long-range successor to Redstone, to compete with Soviet rockets. President Eisenhower announced the U.S. plans to launch an artificial satellite for the International Geophysical Year. This coincided with von Braun's 1954 Project Orbiter proposal using a modified Redstone, but the project lost to the Navy's Vanguard, which was considered purely civilian. Nevertheless, von Braun continued to promote Jupiter-C as the ideal satellite launcher, but failed to convince Congress of the need to outpace the USSR. Most believed the Soviets lacked the technology. Von Braun prepared Jupiter-C for launch and stored the rocket, awaiting the moment when Vanguard would fail. Contrary to political orders, the team kept working on the satellite. On 4 October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, opening the space age. Learning of this, Wernher von Braun stated that the U.S. could have launched a satellite 2 years earlier. He proposed launching Jupiter-C within 60 days as a riposte. Von Braun actively lobbied to support space programs, warning of the Soviet threat. After the Soviet launch of Sputnik 2 with a dog aboard, the U.S. accelerated its response. A modified Jupiter-C, renamed Juno, was ready in January 1958. On 31 January, the rocket successfully placed the first American satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit, confirming the existence of the Van Allen belts. Von Braun called the launch the most thrilling minutes of his life. He became a national hero, helping the U.S. catch up with the Soviet Union in the space race. The German rocket designer began lobbying for innovative launch systems, proposing the Nova booster, for which $10 million were allocated. This became the basis for the Saturn rockets. In April 1958, Eisenhower initiated the creation of NASA, and von Braun's team became a focal point. Although the Army was reluctant to release them, the team had joined NASA by year's end. 3 programs were defined: Mercury for 1 astronaut, Gemini for 2, and Apollo with ambitious goals. Von Braun began integrating the Redstone rocket with the Mercury capsule, aiming to send a human into space before the USSR. In July 1960, von Braun became director of the Marshall Space Flight Center, completing his team's transition to NASA. The first task was to develop the Saturn family of rockets. The name was chosen because Saturn follows Jupiter. The first in the series, Saturn I, had a first stage built from 8 Redstone tanks and H-1 engines derived from the V-2. Alongside Saturn development, 2 test flights were conducted in the Mercury project, including one with the chimpanzee Ham. However, the Soviet Union outpaced the U.S. by launching Yuri Gagarin into space. Believing the Redstone was not yet ready for crewed flights, von Braun initiated additional tests. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American in space, reaching an altitude of 115 miles, 184 kilometers, in a 15-minute suborbital flight on a Redstone rocket. Though not orbital, the U.S. had taken an important step in the space race. President John F. Kennedy, recognizing the U.S. lag in space, asked Vice President Johnson to define a grand goal for dominance in space. Von Braun and NASA leaders proposed landing a man on the moon before 1970, and the plan was approved at the end of May 1961. With substantial funding, von Braun began work on the Saturn V launch vehicle. In 1962, during a visit to the Kennedy Space Center, the president inspected a Saturn model and expressed confidence in the U.S. victory in the space race. On a second visit, Kennedy witnessed a Saturn test firing and praised von Braun's work. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. Wernher von Braun called it a tragic loss but continued working on Apollo. After the successful Saturn, or test flight, he promised Kennedy's widow to fulfill the president's pledge to land a man on the moon. Under von Braun's leadership, the Apollo project advanced, the Mercury program was completed, and the Gemini program began to practice key spaceflight technologies. The U.S. achieved successes, including the first orbital docking. Development of the Saturn V continued, with von Braun emphasizing that it was built not only to reach the moon, but to explore space. The project united 375,000 people and 20,000 companies, but faced criticism for its huge cost. For von Braun, Apollo was not only a race to the moon, but the dawn of a new era of space exploration aimed at other planets. However, the Vietnam War and President Johnson's Great Society programs drained resources, and NASA's budget shrank. In 1968, von Braun expressed concern that the infrastructure being built was crumbling before the moon mission was finished, comparing it to disarming in the midst of war. Despite all obstacles, the Saturn V successfully launched the historic Apollo 11 mission. From the control room, Wernher von Braun watched the rocket lift 3 astronauts skyward. Von Braun was in Houston during the lunar module landing and Neil Armstrong's first step, watched by more than 500 million people worldwide. Returning to Huntsville, the rocket designer thanked his team, stressing that Apollo was a collective effort, and declared that humanity must continue spaceflight, even to Mars. Von Braun was hailed a national hero, and the Apollo 11 crew presented him with an inscribed book acknowledging his contribution to the mission. Yet after the space race ended, difficult times awaited him. Even before the second moon landing, Washington began discussing cuts to Apollo funding. Administrator Tom Paine offered von Braun a move to Washington to head NASA's planning office. He initially refused but agreed, persuaded by his wife and Paine's arguments. In 1970, he began promoting the space shuttle and a Mars mission by 1982. President Nixon, however, did not support these plans, focusing on the Vietnam War. Apollo was funded only to launch the Skylab space station by year's end. Of von Braun's ideas, only the space shuttle program progressed. The Mars mission was canceled. Relations with new administrator George Low deteriorated. Low had Jewish roots, and some claimed he sought to punish von Braun for the V-2. Ultimately, the German rocket designer found himself increasingly sidelined. After 2 pessimistic years, von Braun acknowledged that his long-term plans would not be realized soon. He urged employees to seek new opportunities and on 26 May 1972 announced his resignation from NASA. After leaving NASA, Wernher von Braun became a vice president at Fairchild Industries, working on satellite development programs and promoting their use for education in developing countries. In 1974, doctors discovered cancer in Wernher von Braun. Unfortunately, after several operations, his condition worsened. Although he continued working, his activity diminished, and in April 1976, he gave his last video interview. In January 1977, President Gerald Ford awarded von Braun the National Medal of Science. Because of his grave condition, the medal was presented to him in his hospital room. On June 16, 1977, von Braun died at the age of 65 and was buried quickly in Virginia. Von Braun's legacy remains controversial. Some view him as a hero who glorified the American space program. Others criticize him for working for Nazi Germany and creating the V2. He strove to explore space at any cost, even by dubious means. At the same time, von Braun supported education, civil rights, and earth sciences. Whether his achievements can atone for his wartime past remains an open question.